So today I thought we might look at the performance of my Oikos Digital site. We will look here a little bit at Statamic and its page caching. We'll try out different caching options. We'll make use of CloudFlare and see how that affects things. We'll look at how to investigate the timings of loading a page on your site, and we'll compare a couple of servers. So quite a lot to get through. Let's see what we can do. So the site is built on Statamic, which is a content management system which has static caching built in. Now I can't remember if I'm using static caching currently. So first thing is to go to, this is the command line where I'm logged in to the server. I'm using Laravel Forge to deploy my website to the server. And what I'm going to need to do is edit a config file. So if I go to edit config /Statamic/static caching.php, then I'm using a strategy half here. Now, is there a none strategy? I want to turn this off and get a baseline. Let's just go to statamic.dev, which is the docs for Statamic 3. Search for static caching and set it to null to disable static caching completely. So this strategy here in the config, I will need to set that to null. Let's just comment this out. And then we'll delete the half and set it to null. So that turns the caching off on this copy of the site at least. And then we'll need to clear the cache. So Statamic has a command line interface called please. So I need to run php please static clear. Your page cache is now so very, very empty, which is what we want. Cool, so we now should not be static caching. We're going to do a cache clear as well, just to be sure. Okay, good. So now, this is the site. I'm not going to load it up just yet. I've got DevTools open here, and I'm on the Network tab. Just make this a bit bigger. Might hinder us later having large text, but make it easier for you to see in the time being. And the Network tab will show us the requests that get made. And cleverly over on the right hand side here in this final column, we can see timings, and we can look at those in more detail if we click on them. Now my first load is going to be a bit slow we're not doing static caching, but there'll be some Statamic internal caching that gets done. So my first load I'm expecting to be a bit slow. Let's do that. It wasn't all that slow at all. It's interesting. So let's have a look. So click on, let's get rid of this. I'm in Firefox in case my DevTools looks different to yours, but this is the main request to load the page. It took 365 milliseconds, we can see over there. And if I click on it and click on this timings tab here, we can see a breakdown of what that request timing was. So it was blocked for 87 milliseconds. That means the browser was waiting for something, I think. We did 0 milliseconds DNS resolution. So DNS is cached. We spent 28 milliseconds connecting, 56 milliseconds setting up TLS for HTTPS security. Took 0 milliseconds to send a response. Then we waited 192 milliseconds and spent 0 milliseconds receiving. Now I think Firefox's timings on receiving are out because this wasn't cached. I actually transferred 6.78 KB, which is compressed from the raw 22.07 KB, and it's telling me it took 0 milliseconds to download that, which I don't believe. So this 192 milliseconds, this is where we're waiting for the server to do its work, and that means that was and that's the bulk of the delay in this case actually. A lot of this blocked connecting TLS setup are kind of will reduce and go away, even though DNS resolution is already cached. If I do another reload, we've now hopefully done internal Statamic caching, and it's remembered a load of stuff, and so the next page request should be a bit quicker. So we load that. Still 223, which is interesting. A long, even longer wait. So all these things, DNS resolution, connecting, and everything are down to 0. And it took me 221 seconds for the server to build the page. Let's just have a third go at that. So getting about 200 milliseconds. Okay, that's interesting. So what I'm going to do now is, remember that's 200 milliseconds waiting. Let's go back to item, and we will go and edit the static caching config again. Let's set it to half. And what I think this means is that, let's write that file. What I think this means is that the requests will still come in to Statamic, and the Statamic application will run, but fairly early in the request cycle, I would guess. Statamic will say, hey, I don't need to build a page because there's already one. Now I'm just going to quickly log into Forge. So this is a Laravel tool. It's a bit like Server Pilot or RunCloud or SpinUpWP if you use such a thing. It does a lot of the management of your server for you, and it does automatic deployment from GitHub repositories. So it lets you edit your Nginx config down here. And I need to make sure that, so there's some config somewhere for, where have I put it? Maybe I deleted it. This here is where it says, try looking for the page, and if the page doesn't exist, send it to index.php, pass the query string along. There is another, so if I go to Statamic's docs, if you enable full caching, then you need to have this as your Nginx config. This will look for a static file first and serve that. Now I just want to check that I'm not using the full static caching rule, and I'm not, so that's good. Cool. So I'm going to cancel this. The trouble with if I had the full static caching rule in that config is that the half caching strategy I think would still generate the files. And so enabling half caching would actually enable full caching if those rules were still there, but with old output, something like that. Anyway, full caching is disabled in the Nginx config, and that's what I wanted. So everything should now, if I load, we should have half caching enabled. So let's load this again. We'll reload it by itself. Interesting. And what do we get this time? So my waiting is now down to 82 milliseconds on a reload. Let's do that again, just to check we're using the cached amount. So I'm getting 57, 80, slightly different each time, 71. So we're averaging sort of 60 to 70 milliseconds wait instead of about 200 that we had before, wasn't it? So we've reduced our wait time, and 200 milliseconds is 0.2 of a second. It's not very long, but actually this is better. I like it a lot. Interestingly, other pages, so let's go to about, which has kind of less stuff on it. So the initial load is 158, because that's the first time we've viewed that page. And a reload, we're getting about 62 milliseconds. So it's about the same. There's not much difference in the pages in terms of the amount of server-side processing going on. So that's cool. Let's try it with full caching. Now I was really surprised that full caching didn't previously seem to make a huge amount of difference. But let's switch back to the terminal, edit static caching. Let's change this to full. Let's just double check that I'm setting it to the right thing. So this is half, strategy full, and then we'll need to add the server rewrite rules. So I'm going to copy this. I'm going to go over to Forge. I'm going to edit the Nginx config. Put it in here. And we'll comment this one out. Logging after that easy to use hash key on the Mac keyboard. Cool, so this is going to attempt to find a file called /static, some URI, some arguments.html. If it finds it, return it, and otherwise run Statamic to generate the page. Save that. And so that should have, interesting, conflicting server names. Do run multiple things on this box, but that's kind of weird. Very strange. Okay, don't know why that's come up. Let's restart Nginx for good measure. Let's just make sure this is written. Right, so we saved the static caching config, and then I'm going to do PHP, please, static clear. Ooh, what's up with that? Oh, perhaps it won't clear this directory. It actually doesn't exist, so there's nothing to clear, so it's failing. That's interesting. So presumably when I run Statamic, it will create the public static directory where it keeps the statically cached HTML files. And then a subsequent static clear will work. Okay, so let's just go with that, and let's do a cache clear for good measure 2. Good. Right, so should all be clean. Let's do a reload. That was slow first time while it generated the page, wasn't it? 1.5 seconds. Not so great. 1.1 seconds there. And we did a DNS resolution, which is interesting. So my DNS cache had timed out. 1.1 seconds to generate the page, but the reload should hopefully be fast. That was fast. I like that. So getting 42 milliseconds there. Let's go to the home page. That's the initial load, 200 milliseconds, and a reload with the cached file. We're down to 31. Just repeat that. Down to 42. So we've gone from 200 milliseconds to about 60 or 70 with half caching, and then down to about 42 with full static page caching. I'm kind of surprised that we don't get less than 30 to 40 milliseconds here with full caching, but that's my server. That was 106. That's really interesting. The variation is kind of strange. So that's doing 216 on the same page with the same static cache. Maybe my server's just busy sometimes. Anyway, on a good request, we're getting 30 to 40 milliseconds. So we've saved quite a lot of time and performance. This is pretty sweet and speedy, other than the flash of unstyled fonts, which I need to sort out. Let's test out CloudFlare and see how CloudFlare helps us. We are loading 188 kilobytes of stuff here. We're finishing in 565 milliseconds. DOM content loaded 304 and loading at 500. So it's about half a second for a full page load. Is that repeated? Half a second-ish, just over half a second. And you'd think with a page of this site and the kind of speeds we're getting that this is quite high actually. So let's turn CloudFlare off and see what difference it makes. Sorry, turn CloudFlare on. So I'm going to here. So currently CloudFlare is configured for DNS only. If I click, there we go. You have to do a couple of clicks. So this is now being proxied through CloudFlare. And what we should see is a little header come back to say that that is happening. So let's reload the page now, see what happens. We should get like a CloudFlare header to say that you're using CloudFlare. So this in the network tab, I'm on a request looking at the headers. These are the HTTP headers that get sent and received during the request. Maybe CloudFlare just hasn't taken effect yet. So maybe this isn't something we can cover off today. We'll leave this for now. I'm kind of happy that we've demonstrated how to use this timings tab to see how our server is performing. We've tried out Statamic's various different kinds of caching, and we've seen the performance impact of those on our page loads. And we've discovered that CloudFlare doesn't quite do what we want it to just yet. So it may be that this DNS change here just takes a while to propagate, I think. So my server is this address here, 178.62.8430. And on my page load, we were going to 178.62.8430. So I just think maybe that is like an official proper DNS change that we're waiting for that to happen. and we're still going straight to the server rather than waiting for Cloudflare's proxy to work. So maybe I'll come back later and check if the Cloudflare proxy has made any difference. Hopefully this was useful to you to see how we're tweaking performance and trying to make some improvements in terms of page load times. Still lots more to do on the site, but maybe this was helpful to see. So here we are a short while later, and the DNS from Cloudflare needed to propagate. I don't know why I forgot about that. You know, you got a brain full of stuff, and we're in the middle of a pandemic and working from home and all those things, and I just forgot that I had to do that. But the Cloudflare DNS has now propagated. So the site is now serving through Cloudflare's proxy, and we can see that. So if I go into my DevTools and go to the Network tab and reload the page, we'll see if I click on anything that's served from my domain that I get a CF cache status, which is Cloudflare cache status, array ID, and the request ID. So these headers that are being sent back from Cloudflare, they tell us some stuff about what Cloudflare is doing. I don't know what these things are, but yeah, so they identify that Cloudflare is being used, and I can also see that in the remote IP address here as well, which is also Cloudflare's IP. So Cloudflare is working. Let's have a look at the timings then. So if we go to Network and Timings and then do a reload on this, then I can see that this had a 90 milliseconds wait, and my CSS for my chatbot had 43 milliseconds wait. So we're not getting much different. And you'll remember our total times for the page were around half a second, and if anything, that's gone up by using Cloudflare. There's approximately half a second. There's 800 milliseconds. So it's actually like a tiny bit slower through Cloudflare rather than going direct to the server. So that's not great in this particular setup, but it's worth saying that this is one site running on a small virtual private server, VPS, and that VPS is really quiet. My website doesn't actually get that many hits. If it was getting lots of hits and if it was serving lots of traffic, then Cloudflare would be relieving me of most of that load. So that's a really helpful thing for Cloudflare to be set up for those times when the site gets busy, because it relieves all the load from my server. But also Cloudflare will cache at edge servers all around the world. So somebody on the other side of the world in Australia looking at my website, they might get it served from a Cloudflare server in Australia, and it won't be having to make that trip halfway around the world to come back to my server in the UK and then have the response sent all the way back. So even though it is a tiny bit slower for this request for this site on this server from this physical location that I'm in, that's not to say that Cloudflare isn't a helpful thing to add. And using a CDN can be really recommended, especially for busy sites. There are downsides to using a CDN, so it does implement another layer of caching, which you have to bust through sometimes when you're making changes. So you might make a change on your site and then have to go and purge your Cloudflare cache or wait for Cloudflare to detect that that has changed and clear its own caching out. So it's not all roses. There are things that you have to think about when you're implementing a CDN like Cloudflare. But again, for a busy site, it's worth taking that little shot of pain in order to get quite a lot of benefit and relieve pressure on your servers. So hopefully this has been interesting, looking through these performance metrics and the different kinds of caching in Statamic. We got some really good times here because it's a very lightweight site. And we've looked at the different options available to us, both on the server and using a CDN. So go forth and measure the timings on your site. And if you're using Statamic, try out the different caches, see if you can make some improvements and implement a CDN if you can and if you need to. That's all from me on this topic. I'll be back with more Statamic stuff and other stuff some other time.